And you and I know that it takes more than just talk. It takes, you can even think of the amount of resources needed to actually elicit impact on the ground. So to me, I think when you say climate change, it's a very general word. But one of the ways that can be, probably we can does a lot of more work than it's a water and sanitation company, but you'll find that it has a lot of engagements on the public, this kind of fora. You can see even like today here, we have diverse number of people discussing climate change. But again, the challenge, even as individuals, what do we do ourselves? Are we minimalist? Yeah, before we even get to organizations, even as individuals who are, how do we respond to climate change in our own individual lifestyles before we even get to the grassroots? Thank you.
Okay, my name is Grace Lolim. I come from Isiolo County, where we are badly hit by climate change. My question goes to, I don't know if he's still around. There was Climate Change Act 2016, and then there is an Amendment Act where I have seen that the civil society organizations and the academia have been left out. And I believe the room is full of the civil society organization and academia. Now, from the government side, how can we contribute while we are outside? We can never even question the government. The second one is, I'm seeing the government is more into mitigation than adaptation. But for me, I think adaptation should have weight than mitigation, or they can go concurrently. Because in northern Kenya, we have been hit by climate change, and our animals have died. Our people are also dying because of hunger. Now, if we say mitigation, can we just leave it as it is, or we can make people to adapt to other ways of life? Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Biwott. I want to first admit, Mr. Biwott, what you presented earlier in the day. It was very informative, and the work they're doing in Eldoret and probably was in Gishu. So congratulations for the work you're doing. But again, if I had not come to this meeting, I would not have known the great work that you're doing in Eldoret. So the question is, do you have specific plan to ensure that you communicate what exactly you're doing, so for the rest of the country, so that we also know that there are also good things that are happening? Because I have a problem with the ethical reporting that we have in this country, where we are always portraying ourselves as people in need. But again, we're also talking of, there was a question which came from the online audience that we need to localize our interventions. We need to localize how do we respond to our problems? So the thing is, can we also bring on board the mainstream media practitioners? I wish, I don't know whether they're in this meeting today, to also bring a lot of ethical perspectives in the reporting the African story, which also includes us as Kenyans in this country. So I think for me, that is the conversation that I want to bring on board, and my contribution, and my question to Mr. Biwott. Thank you very much.
I think because of time, I'll just take one more from that side.
Thank you very much for giving me that time. My name is Joshua Adem. I'm in the public health, that is human and environmental health. From the discussions, and what captured my mind mostly is when you spoke of localization and how to trickle this knowledge down to the community level. I feel I would like to ask one of the panelists, Mr. Cheo, who are those in the front, how can we also bring in the indigenous knowledge into this? Because this one gap where I see, because we think by using the indigenous knowledge, there's a gap here. Also see the terminologies. The terminologies is also a problem here, because I can ask you now, for example, how do you call airtime in Swahili? In Swahili, how do you call airtime? You can't tell this because it is difficult, it is complex to translate this. So if we can use our indigenous knowledge and also to involve the simple terminologies in our work in climate change, I think we'll go far. So thank you very much, and let us see how to include the indigenous knowledge into the climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Biwott.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. I really appreciate. I'll respond very fast because I have to catch the next flight to Eldoret. Yeah, so involvement, public participation or involvement of people with disabilities in climate action. At least for us, as Eldoas, we've changed our articles of association as a company, and we have actually provided for a position in the board for a person with disabilities. So that's how we want to engage people with disabilities in terms of our work. And also, as we do public participation, we also ensure that people with disabilities in our hometown and catchment area are also involved, because everyone's knowledge is very important. In fact, in our staffing, for the last 1.5 years I've been in Eldoas, I've actually employed 2 people with disabilities, and they're doing a commendable job. So this is what I think, even as a country, we need to do. Now, in terms of government policy, we have to be deliberate and intentional, as you heard the president saying during the devolution conference, and public participation should not be paid lip service, and we should make sure that even as we engage Raia, we take their names and their contacts and they be part of the reports that we do, and also the feedback mechanism that we engage, including even development of the monitoring and evaluation frameworks. Because climate action, what we have understood from our experience, at least in Eldoret, is that you have to engage the community in growing the trees. Because as soon as you leave, they have to own the process. What do we do as a company, or what do we do as a water sector? Fencing of areas to plant, we involve the local community. Digging of the holes to plant, we involve the local community, and actually we pay based on the minimum wage law that is provided under, in our country. It's actually gazetted. And in terms of the law, climate change law, really I have no authority to comment about it, but what I can say is that the legal process in the country provides for public participation. When the laws are being changed, there is how it starts at the ministry, public participation, coming up with a policy, like we have a water policy, we have an environment policy, and then it goes to the parliament, where they develop the law, and before enactment, they actually call for submission from various stakeholders. So that's what I can actually say. In terms of broadcasting what we do, I want to assure the gentleman who asked the question about if he had not come to this forum, might be he would not have known about what the Eldoret Water is doing. Our Facebook platform is very live. If you go to our Twitter, quite active. We have set up a communication department, and under the water sector, Water Providers Association, where I'm the vice chair, I've been encouraging the 106 water companies in the Republic to set up communication departments. And we have a program on best practice, which we normally exchange from our various companies. And as much as possible, we try to reach out to Kenyans to pay attention. I'm actually the vice chair in charge of advocacy. And I want to invite you, hata kama ununuangi Nation, nunua tu leo. I'm not marketing for them, but at least there's an article there I've written, and you can see how we are boldly contributing to issues of environment and water and the like in our country. I want to encourage you also to take interest in social media. Many of our Kenyans go to social media for politics. They go to follow politics. What has President said, Azimio inasema nini, vitu kama hizo. Go and look for educative posts and engagements. Our Linda Maji program actually He's the loudest in the Republic. Because under Linda Maji Mtaani, even the big fish to Meshika Awa, when you're neighbor Maji, and we've actually taken them to court, those who steal water. And we are rallying the community in our hometown to help us in reporting water leakages and also helping us to report those who have done illegal connections. Of course, localization of solutions, I agree with the gentleman there. We even need to change to make our communication as simple as possible. In every sector, like communication for climate action or for climate change, we need to enhance communication, media engagements, the fourth estate to be part of this. And I think as a laureate water, personally, I've really been able to contribute a lot. And even if you follow the tagline of the First Lady, the President, the CS for Environment, there's a forum called Africa Water Forum, which is helping us to establish what we call fund. We have Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund. We have Jumuiya, where we are looking at catchment conservation up to the top, making sure that everybody participates and conserves the environment so that every one of us can actually be able to access water. Water and sanitation is a key human right under our Article 43 of our Katiba. And in terms of SDGs, we have SDG number 6 on water and sanitation. We have SDG number 11 on sustainable cities and urban centers. And cities cannot be sustainable if there's no water, if we cannot conserve environment. There's SDG number 13 on climate action, and of course SDG number 17 on global partnerships for development. Of course, I cannot mention the other one on, the first one on issues of food security, eradication of poverty. One of the biggest challenges to climate action is poverty, because mama at the village goes to fetch firewood because they don't have an option. So if we can do green energy, if we can do modern farming methods, we should be able to turn around and redirect our families to focus on what matters. Yeah, so, and it's a concerted effort by all of us. I know you are professionals coming from certain regions of Kenya. Don't just stay in the ivory tower in Nairobi. Just go back to the rural areas. Go and make impact in where you come from. Influence through your social media and your engagement. I speak a lot in our local Kalenjin radio stations, just trying to encourage them on issues of economy, issues of climate. And that's how you can also disseminate in Ramogi FM, in those other radio stations and media stations. Na muandika articles in our newspapers. Mulisoma literature, mukaandika composition. Why can't you write articles on things that matter? They say death begins when you keep quiet on things that matter. Sasa uliandika composition na insha, why can't you write again now? Spend time, write, talk to the editors, just be friendly with them. They don't even require anything in these newspapers. And get your voice out there to be heard. Asante sana, Mungu awabariki.
So I hope our questions have been answered. And the many that have remained, I know there's a lot of burning questions, but we are going to have a plenary session, and we can do this again in the afternoon. So that session, so for this session, it is themed the emergence of climate litigation and grassroots activism. So for this session, I'll like to invite Dr. Kibugi. He's going to take us through a session on climate justice. Dr. Kibugi is a faculty member at the University of Nairobi, Faculty of Law. Welcome.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here this morning. When I stand in an auditorium like this, I just go back to a classroom. So it is a natural habitat for me. As you've heard, I come from the Faculty of Law of the University of Nairobi. My discipline is matters around environment, natural resources, climate change, governance, and related matters. So what I'd like to do before we can have the panel is we had a very good start in the morning, But at some point, I felt like we were also flying above water, and we needed to dig into some of these perspectives a little bit. So I would like to combine my background as a lawyer, a teacher, and working in public policy to try and put a bit of context. I've tried to title the presentation in a more provocative manner. And the reason for talking about heresy is because there is a lot of tendency for a contrarian view by especially younger Kenyans questioning, is this climate change true? Is it a fraud? Is it a Western conspiracy? Are we being taken for granted, etc.? And it is important for us to understand, is that the case, or are we really in trouble? Are we facing an existential challenge, as the case may be? And to do that, it is important to understand a few things. So the first point there is to ask, is it global warming or is it climate change? And I'm sure from time to time we hear these terms being used in law, in teaching. Language and narratives matter. When we say it is climate change, it almost comes out as an autonomous result that just happened, right? But when we speak about global warming, the question is, who is warming the globe? Who is responsible for warming the globe in this case? And this is the fundamental issue, that in fact, like I say, there are several parts to the question. And the first most difficult part relates to the question of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the keynote speaker said that we have got a fairly negligible contributions, to historical contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. I think figures range from 0.01 to 0.1 or thereabouts, non-specific. The truth, though, is that as Kenya is today, we are actually contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in agriculture and transportation, but mostly in agriculture and a bit of deforestation, and we're doing great in terms of energy. We are actually exceeding the level of achievement in terms of reversing our emissions for purposes because of renewable energy. But these anthropogenic emissions are the problem, because eventually, as we have learned from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a variety of scientists, and I think a colleague from the University of Nairobi this last week just got appointed to head the IPCC working group on adaptation. So Kenya is also involved in the generation of the evidence, is that this is what is responsible for changing of the global climate change. And I'll demonstrate some evidence in a minute. But if we were to accept that there is a warming of the globe, and by who? Anthropogenic is by us, and by us, you know, could be people in different parts of the world or ourselves. That's a different question of equity and justice. What we have to accept is that we sitting here on the African continent then face an even bigger problem from the climate risks, the hazards. And these hazards are a problem because we have always had a problem with droughts, except when we grew up, we were told droughts occurred once in 10 years, 20 years, isn't it? The 2014 through 2018 drought segued into the 2019 to 2023 drought. And we'll talk about that more, which means that almost without a break, the Republic of Kenya and the Horn of Africa have seen almost 10 years of continuous debilitating drought, isn't it? And this is largely a combination of two factors, temperature and rainfall patterns changing. And this is really the problem we face. And again, we'll show how that is working. And then the impacts, the risks, these are the hazards. They will come, droughts, floods, desert locusts, heat stress, they will come. And until and unless, as we are told by the scientists, we can fix the emissions, the hazards will keep coming. And their frequency will be more, and their anger will be like never seen before. And guess what? Those of us who have the least ability to cope, what we call vulnerability, we have the highest level of vulnerability, we will see the worst consequences. A little bit of a war in Ukraine, and we are hungry. See the problem? And we are a farming country where 52% of our GDP is from agriculture, and 9 million direct and indirect jobs, according to the government, are in the agriculture sector, and we still cannot feed ourselves. So we've got serious problems in this respect. So these impacts, so there is a sequence. It's very hierarchical. We have the global warming, we have the risks and the hazards, then we have the impacts that we are dealing with today, and then the climate action that we take. And this is the question with respect to what, who is taking part, who is leading. The discussion this morning was about that, isn't it? Climate action. What climate action? With respect to what? Who is leading this climate action, etc. Let's move to the next slide, please. Now, greenhouse gas emissions, as we know, inevitably result, they always did and still do result from human, social, and economic activities. Historically, this has been through the burning of hydrocarbons like coal, petroleum, etc., for a variety of activities to generate energy, transportation, industrial processes, and so on and so forth. So historically, that has always been the case and still the case. And the truth is that the emissions are innocently or typically generated to bring about socioeconomic progression. It may be equitable, it may not be equitable, but the side effect of it is that these emissions largely trace to the energy grid, power, electricity, power, to fuel vehicles, to fuel economic activities, to fuel residential heating. That's the culprit. So if we ever figure out the source of power, we will deal with most of the greenhouse gas emission problems that we have. But historically, up to today, and countries even like ours will continue with these emissions because of the sources of energy we use. At least in our case, the energy grid is shifting quite a bit, but also because of agriculture. Agriculture, how we deal with our farms, expansion of agriculture is a major contributor of greenhouse gases in this respect. And so the key sources we know is energy, transport, forestry, agriculture, industry, waste. These are all pertinent to human life. So when we talk about climate justice, climate injustice, the inequity, the harm that may occur, as we try to deal with the emissions, you realize most of the action has to happen in those sectors, isn't it? So let's tomorrow say we don't want any more emissions from vehicles, work from home. Let's say the government of Kenya says they want to build 450 kilometers of non-motorized transportation, footpaths, etc. Let's build 100,000 and let's ground vehicles and walk around. How many of us are going to work from home? Very difficult, isn't it? So there is the fact that because we need transportation, we're going to have to find alternative sources of doing this. And I think we're having a conversation about e-mobility, electric borders, buses, etc. Like I said, emissions are related to economic activity across the globe, wherever. We all love good figures. We are all Kenyans lately thinking very fondly of the late President Moi, until we turn over to the impacts, the impacts and how this level of warming we have contributes to the hazards and the impacts. I would say, however, that the justice question here is about the level of responsibility to be taken by societies with regard to how much their emissions, past and present, are contributing to anthropogenic global warming across the world, and to what extent we as Kenyans, for example, can then draw the line and say, yes, we know that, the fellows that were doing this before, between 1850 and 1992, have responsibility for that, but we also need to have responsibility for what is going on. And that's a very difficult conversation, because often dealing with emissions reductions involves economic transitions that are very costly, may result in loss of jobs and incomes, business opportunities, and which we are mostly not ready for. So this is the part that we have to take into account. But when you look at emissions, the larger concerns for us sitting in an African country, therefore, should be on those emissions that we know are contributing to the recurrence of climate hazards and climate risks, and the impacts this fundamentally for us to understand. Hazards, What we know today as hazards are what we traditionally refer to as extreme weather events. It's not unusual for the March, April rainfall, a bit of drought. Fall armyworms used to show up every 30 years and they decimate maize for 2 seasons and then they'd go back and come back for after another 30 years. It would be a myth, isn't it? Now the African Development Bank and the African Union have a 38-country program across Africa to deal specifically with the disaster called fall armyworms, which are clearing out crops and pasture across the continent at an alarming rate. So this is now, when we talk, we're moving from an extreme event to a hazard. It's now a biophysical event that is causing significant harm. Now, hazards on their own, they are okay, right? If the river floods today, Nairobi River or Tana River floods today, and all the livestock from Tana River and Garissa are safely up there away from and all the pastoralists have water elsewhere and they are safely away from the river. We'll all just say, you know, the Tana flooded, the dams were opened, the ocean got full, and we move on, right? Except the problem is that floods often come on the back end of a drought. So when they come, there will be a lot of people in the low-lying areas looking for pasture, looking for livestock, etc., isn't it? They'll already have lost livestock, they'll already have lost family members, and the floods will come and even cause more damage. That's the problem. So the main climate events we worry about in terms of the risks are temperature, sea level rise, and changing patterns, rainfall patterns. Next slide. So when we look at temperature, the Kenya Meteorological Department tells us that, and I've just looked at 3 stations for us to see, tells us that there has been a significant change in the way temperatures have been demonstrating. So for example, this is a recent report, State of Climate Report 2022. And they tell us that, for example, temperature recorded at the Kitale station, you can see the trend is in blue between 1991 and 2020, and this is 2022. This is the March, April, May rainfall season, right? How have the temperatures gone? Higher, isn't it? Which means that farmers in this period are going to be experiencing more dry days within the March, April, May rainfall season, which is the main rainfall season for the Republic of Kenya. And again, in the Rift Valley area, they also use the June, July, August rainfall season for producing. Again, the temperatures are way colder. Can you see that? And let's move on to the next slide. Mombasa, I think you can see the trend, isn't it? It's getting hotter when it shouldn't be hot. It's getting colder than normal in different instances, for instance. And so, for example, you can see what the July-August season will do to tourism in the long term in the Mombasa region if it keeps getting colder and colder and colder. You just need to go to the Indian Ocean resorts further south in Mozambique, South Africa, during this time of the year and see how unfriendly they are. Next slide. So what we know is that there are variations in temperature across the country, a lot less felt in the coastal region, but particularly in the arid and semi-arid lands in the country. And out of the 47 counties in the Republic of Kenya, 23 are considered to be ASAL. So these are the ones that are marginal in terms of rainfall and temperature. And in those, for 5 of those counties, as you can see, have seen a temperature increases of greater than 1.5% Celsius over the last half decade. And you can see how significant that is in terms of counties that where people rely on agriculture or rely on pastoralism and where marginal changes in temperature, present potentially disastrous outcomes. Let's move on. In terms of rainfall, sorry, this didn't come out as big as I thought, but the original trend in 1971 to 1980 is here, up here, is high up in all instances. Now look at the trend in rainfall, and you can see again the trend. And we have 3 rainfall seasons in Kenya: March, April, May. This is what we know as the long rainfall season for most of the country. Then we have the October, November, December rainfall, short rains. And then we have the June, July, JJA rainfall that is common to the Rift Valley region, up to part of the Nyanza belt. This is the counties, and the counties that rely on the June, July, August are unique because they have a single harvest. So if that rainfall fails or falls, their crop is likely to, and this is also what we know as the breadbasket of Kenya, isn't it? The Kitales, the Uasin Gishus, and others. So you can see these things are actually happening. And I'm providing you data from Kenya Meteorology Department, from the World Bank, and other more objective, and also IGAD has got very helpful data in that sense. Let's move on to the next. So now let's look at the real burden from impact in terms of drought. This is recently aggregated data on the impact of the drought. 2014, 2013 is when the Horn of Africa drought was recorded as having returned. It was then recorded as having continued 2019 to 2023. So here we are today, isn't it? So essentially we've been having a drought 2011 to 2020, 2014 to 2023. Suffice to remind you, remember the Horn of Africa drought of 2009 to 2011? You recall that one? So if we went back, the length of the drought is getting more longer, the period is getting more longer and severe. The government of Kenya says that this drought we are just seemingly coming out of was the worst in 40 years, both in terms of lack of rainfall and high temperatures. They've taken away my... and again now, looking at recent statistics, that by February 2023, it was estimated about 500,000 people had been displaced across 5 counties in Kenya because of drought. And the figures are even more drastic when you look at across the 23 ASAL countries. If you look at the ASAL counties, about 4.4 million people were facing high levels of acute food insecurity. About more than 750,000 were facing emergencies characterized by high acute malnutrition or excess mortality. And importantly, they were having to employ emergency livelihood strategies, include selling of assets. And 3.6 million people were classified as facing a food security crisis and were marginally able to meet minimum food needs by only depleting essential livelihood assets or through crisis coping strategies. So this is really extreme, because when you talk about people having to deplete essential livelihood assets, you're talking about sale of livestock, sale of land, sale of any form of asset just to stay alive. In different statistics, the International Organization on Migration, IOM, has given very troubling figures about the number of pastoralists that are now opting out of pastoralism altogether. When a pastoralist opts out of pastoralism, they don't go back to farm because it's an arid area, isn't it? And drought is the cause. They come to Nairobi or an urban area to take a semi-skilled job as a watchman, as a guard, at very low income levels. So the cycle of poverty carries on. So those are the burdens we are talking about nationally, because I thought this would be helpful because of the hunger we've had. There was a drop of a couple million bags of maize recorded in between 2021 and 2022 by the Ministry of Agriculture. And this actually doesn't take into context the general drop between the year 2019 and 2023 because of production. But there are places, for example, in the northern Kenya, the bread basket in the arid counties of Garissa and Mandera is usually around the rivers, the Tana and the River Dawa in Mandera. And what they told us is that in certain instances, the floods that occurred in 2022, March, April, May, rainfall, and again in November last year, have kept the land so waterlogged, farmers cannot go ahead and plant for the new season. So this is the burden we are talking about. Let's, we can romanticize these things in very fancy terms, etc. But as Dr. Chiao said earlier, it's a matter of life and death. So there are tremendous implications about this, and that's why I said this is not heresy. we are actually dealing with realities that we are saying are true, because how else do you explain a drought that lasts for 8 or 9 years? How else do you explain failure in rainfalls? How do you explain that the Ministry of Agriculture tells us that in the March, April, May rainfall season, highland counties like Kirinyaga, Nyeri, and others are experiencing up to 60 days of no rainfall. The rainfall comes for 90 days. So when you have 30 to 60 days of no rainfall and it's high moisture stress, you have to irrigate, isn't it? With water, right? We are told that our climate crisis in the Republic of Kenya is one of water deficit. We simply are running out of water. And there are numbers. Anybody here who would like to know, please get a copy of the National Water Master Plan 2030. It gives very, very detailed breakdown of how badly we are doing in terms of water. In the Athi Aquifer, where we are today, we are in the basin. It's mostly because of population and economic activity. In the Ewashong-Iron in the north, is because of evapotranspiration. That's the arid lands, isn't it? So we do have a big problem that we need to deal with. And I thought, Dr. Chiao, that this is a better way to explain the burden than to try and conceptualize it in a manner. We know this, isn't it? We already know this. We might say it's because of coping mechanisms, but we know this is what is happening. And I guess the question now is, these are the burdens. How do we deal with it, and how do we get out of it? Let's move to the next slide. So coming to the climate justice question that was put to us, and the reason we're gathered in this session. As we can see, the burdens are significant. I've only looked at one impact, drought. We haven't ventured into floods, we haven't ventured into locusts, we haven't ventured into other questions. We haven't even ventured into conflict. We recently had to mobilize the Kenya Defense Forces in the north of Kenya for the third time in as many years to support the police in a law and order operation in Baringo, Pokot, West Pokot, and somewhere, and Laikipia, isn't it? Because of conflict arising from battle for pasture and water and incursion into wildlife protection zones, right? One of the questions you ask is, did anybody tell the army commanders planning the operation that we also needed to deal with the problem of lack of water and pasture? Because if they don't, they will be back in another 2 years to do the same thing, isn't it? And so these are the questions that we talk about. So the cost is very high. And the main question for Kenya today is how we implement effective adaptation actions. Adaptation actions, I mentioned earlier that agriculture, it comes out as one of the main areas of greenhouse gas emissions in Kenya. But it's also an area where the government of Kenya has decided they don't matter because we have a food security crisis. So we will farm anyway. And we will explain away that we need to feed our people. After all, the UNFCCC, the convention, and the Paris Agreement in their objectives prioritize food security as part of adaptation, and this is not something debatable. And in any case, emissions that come from livestock in North America and Brazil are very different from the emissions that come from pastoralism here. There is because of expansion, here is because of land degradation. So two different animals, perhaps the same outcome. But we do need adaptation actions that enable our economy, our society, and environment to remain resilient. So the first thing, remain resilient. We need to be able to maintain a normal level of function. It can't be that every time there is a drought, we go hungry. Right? We grew up in homes that, or, generation difference. We heard that homes used to have granaries, isn't it? That was how our ancestors maintained resilience in terms of food. So what is our equivalent today? At individual level, household level, governmental policy level. We need to have a level of resilience, particularly in agriculture production, to maintain normal function. We can't be declaring a drought emergency every 3 years. We need to figure out a way to have a level of normal function. The second thing is then we can't keep doing the same thing over again and cry hunger. So number two, we need to change how we are doing things so that we are less exposed to these climate risks. So how do you farm in a way that makes you less exposed to drought or floods or desert locust or whatnot? The Ministry of Agriculture, State Department of Livestock, is working on what they are calling, I forget the term, but it's some sort of pasture and forage that can grow in degraded pastoralist areas and is going to actually do better when it gets hotter. So I don't understand the science, but sounds like they are onto something if it gets implemented. And then importantly, how do we do those two in a manner that is equitable and sustainably, and that we can fund so that we lessen our vulnerability? You know, I left vulnerability for last because vulnerability, you know, sounds like a very complicated issue, but let me use an example that is a bit live. During COVID, we were told those with pre-existing conditions stay home. Those who are above 58 and above stay at home. Why were we told that? Because you are likely to catch COVID, and if because you are older or you had a condition that made the immunity weaker, you are likely to get a serious form of COVID and you could die, isn't it? That essentially meant that those people were vulnerable to conditions that made their exposure to a serious form of COVID even more significant, isn't it? So in the same thread, we can ask ourselves, to what extent and how is our economy vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change, the droughts, the floods, the locusts, the conflict? To how is our economy, how is our environment, how our society, our people? And you know, we have got a generally young population. If you assume that we normally have about 1 to 1.2 million children in every level of primary school, isn't it? So if you take from PP1 to class 8, that's about 10, 11 million, isn't it? And if you take the other 4 in high school, coming to almost 16 million. So roughly speaking, and I haven't even counted those in college going up to the, you know, communication, but language. What language are we using to communicate to our people? You know, if you look at government public communications in Kenya, they are often in English. Very few, isn't it? So how do we communicate to our people? In what language are we communicating to our people? Of government accountable. I'm talking about the human rights commissions and others with level of success and limitations as is expected. Lawyers and the legal fraternity can play a much broader role in advancing the cause of climate justice. Although I am a lawyer, I started in speaking to you from a perspective of climate science and political economy, because I also wanted to make an indirect point, but that the law is responsive to a problem. So if we are going to make law and policy action, it needs to respond to those problems that we've spoken about and others, not just be a short time to just lay the basis and then we can move on. Just next slide. In case you've never seen the Constitution, in case you've never seen the Climate Change Act, and there is also a lovely report by UNEP, very readable and very helpful. Next slide. When it comes to climate litigation, of course, the question then is how to deal with the various injustices that come around. There are attempts around the world to try and attribute civil responsibility, civil liability to countries or companies, particularly mining companies, because of liability for greenhouse gas emissions. And this has happened like in Latin America, etc., which is very difficult to do, because when it comes to attribution of liability for greenhouse gas emissions, proving causation, proving that, you know, emissions that were caused by the specific activity that Dr. Mumbi was involved in caused the consequences that resulted in the floods that washed away. Science that is evolving, that is being used to try and fix this, but we couldn't possibly cover that today. Even in a PhD class, this is usually a very difficult topic to cover, but it is evolving, but there is not yet a single decision around the world that has advanced on attribution to conclusion. So we will keep watching and seeing. There are causes of actions. You can go to court through a constitutional petition, violation of a statute. You can use the law of torts, that somebody acted negligently, etc. Again, so there are my point emissions, etc. The second part of it that potentially people from island states have tried to use refugee law to seek asylum to other countries because they've said that their homes are coming underwater and they need to move. We've seen one instance declined by the courts in New Zealand, but we've also seen a trial court in France admit a gentleman from Bangladesh who laid a successful claim that his home was at threat from flooding. So these kinds of things happen. When it comes to drought and conflict, there is a community in Baringo in Kenya that currently has an active litigation in the Environment and Land Court. But they're arguing that the government is in violation of a variety of human rights, not taking proper action to do this. So that we can't really talk about it because it's also evolving. Next, as we finish. Next, yes. And then the law allows us to also take action. Section 23 of the Climate Change Act allows any person to apply to the Environment and Land Court alleging that any other person has acted in a manner that is likely to adversely affect efforts towards mitigation and adaptation to the effects of climate change. What is important about this provision is that it is both anticipatory and reactive. You can go to court if somebody is behaving in a manner likely to cause harm, or they are not doing, or they have already caused harm. And this provision is anchored in Article 70 of the Constitution. Article 70, as you may know, is a specific human right to go to court on violation of the human right to a clean and healthy environment. So again, we haven't seen this Section 23 tested fully yet, but Article 70 has been tested over and over and over successfully by our courts. You can also go to court when somebody is in violation of assessments, environment impact assessments, and environmental audits. Generally speaking, you can do that under the Environment Management and Coordination Act in civil court, tribunal, or in criminal court. But Section 20 of the Climate Change Act makes it mandatory that when anybody is doing an SEA, they decide by the National Environment Tribunal. The National Environment Tribunal considered the very now infamous case of Save Lamu, and many others versus NEMA and Amu Power. You remember the coal power plant in Lamu? And this was declined of public participation, and the court said that NEMA appeared to have only formally endorsed the EIS study. They didn't really do their job, but the court also found that Amu Power's own witness agreed to the court that they failed to consider certain factors such as the impact of climate change in relation to the Climate Change Act in order to determine compliance. This then marked the first time when Section 20 of the applied by a court, this time by the National Environment Tribunal, in order to demonstrate that provisions can have some teeth. And as you know, on the basis of that combination, the Lamu Power coal plant died a natural death. So again, we can say that with little effect here and there, we've seen successes here and there. I think my message is that we do have a big problem we are facing from our side of the world. We are seeing impacts that continue to come at a very high cost in terms of human life, in terms of quality of human life, and in terms of the risks that we face. And beyond, in terms of climate justice, I think there are very many policy-level decisions, development-level decisions, and just human development-level actions that can be undertaken by government, by ourselves, because we collectively comprise civil society, isn't it, that we can actually take. But where there is a problem, particularly a problem that concerns use of public power, there is leeway for us to use the judicial system, to use the legal system to do this. But you have to remember that Kenya operates in an adversarial legal system. You have to go to court and determine based on the quality of the evidence you bring to the court. So it comes of a public interest, environmental nature, the Lamu-related cases, etc. It's very costly to assemble the type of professional evidence and witnesses you need to put together. Lead power battery They have been sent to the Court of Appeal, then decision, or somewhere, maybe by the time we're auditing for the 15 billion trees in 2032, they might have a decision. This is the trouble with the legal framework. So as I conclude, we should always try to look for less contentious and more friendly approaches to solve discipline before you fall back on the judicial system, because it can be expensive, it can take long, and the outcomes you may not like. Thank you very much.
As I listened to you, I kept asking myself, this is a bit scary. But it's good that we are talking about it. And so I'd like to invite Dr. Chiao to just give you a token of appreciation. So thank you for your time, the insights. Thank you. Yes, you can take a seat and at least catch your breath. So now I'd like to introduce Jackson Obare. Jackson is the Eastern and South African manager at Forum CIV. So welcome.
I could see the energy levels have gone down. Daktari, that was very heavy, so that they needed time to digest and process. But I want to take a softer approach. I don't have the hard stuff, so I'm not neither projecting anything here for you. So my name has already been introduced, Jackson Obare, Regional Manager for Forum CIV, based here in Nairobi. And we are quite excited as Forum CIV to co-partner with Strathmore University in organizing this inaugural conference on environment, climate change, and sustainability. Forum CIV, for those of you who may not be knowing, is a Swedish international organization working on the space of democracy, human rights, gender equality, and climate justice. And our daily work with my colleagues around the world, a sustainable world, where you and me have the power to effect change. That's very powerful, isn't it? So, and we do this through different approaches with our offices that are regional and country and operating in 70 countries around the globe. So this Nairobi office is one of the regional offices that we have. I want to start my remarks, and I will pose some questions to the embassy. So today we also are privileged to have the Sweden government represented here, so that they can also have questions to respond to before the next session comes. 2 days ago, as I was planning for this conference, the children are back from school on short holiday, half-term break, and one of my daughters asked me that I have read that you are going for a conference on Friday. And what is about the conference? Then I said it is on environment, climate, and sustainability conference. Then she said, after dinner, I could want us to have a panel discussion. That we can help you with points, you cannot go project. And so she said, are we invited in that conference? So looking at this, I didn't see any child, any teen. So a challenge for us. So then they posed 2 daughters and a son. They asked the son to be the journalist, and they was, the way you can mimic the journalist going around, people speaking, and they told me to be the moderator. But at the end of the day, my daughter became now the moderator, now asking me questions also to answer. So they said, in this conversation you are going to have on Friday, have you considered the participation of teens and children? Because she's a teen and her two siblings are children. Or you are also only going to talk about old people who don't consider the interest of the teens and the children in the climate change conversations. I wanted to call Lynette to ask her whether I can bring her, but there are other competing events they are attending to, so maybe next time. And she said, I want to go to that university and also see. Their context is in another university, so they also want to come to Strathmore and see how Strathmore itself has planned to ensure sustainability and environment and climate change in their practices and in their work. So that's on a softer start, right? I'm supposed to speak about climate advocacy, and most of the time, you know, the civil society space, we talk about advocacy, lobbying and advocacy, isn't it? These are the very common terms. We are advocating for this. We are lobbying for this. And I guess all of us understand what that advocacy means. In putting us in the same context, that what we are advocating for is to ensure that the activities or the policies, anything that is happening at the national, sub-national, regional, and international level, puts the community lobbying implementation happens somewhere, isn't it? And this implementation is happening at the community level. And therefore, in my understanding, advocacy is making a reference to us participating in invited spaces. Lobbying is claimed spaces. When we lobby, we are claiming, you know? We create and claim this is our space. But advocacy, you have to be invited in these spaces and also project your voice so that you can cause influence with the policies, laws that are being enacted. But you cannot go without evidence. And I'm listening very carefully, the presenters before me. Daktari has spoken about the evidence. He's projecting, giving us statistics, right? When you are your narrative, so that people can see the impact of it and the import of it. And therefore, scientific evidence must inform policy advocacy processes. And the actors, we've talked about civil society being part of the forum, private sector were here, the water companies were here, the government, county government, Kennedy was here, and also haven't seen the media. Can we say the university media? But we also work with the civil side. There's a category as Forum C, we work with artists. And that's why this topic is give them a platform, not only for entertainment. You know, every time we say, call these musicians to come and entertain us. Now we are tired, we need entertainment. It is not that. It can be a form of entertainment, but people need to listen to the message that they are having that is packaged under this entertainment. And I am proud for MCIF, among many, we have a number of partners here. We have a small upcoming partner called Mukuru Youth Initiative, MUI. In one of our project phase, they produced a song on pollution and its negative effects, especially in informal settlements and what the actors need to do to fix it. If you listen to the song, and we had the World Environment Day, that song came in handy because people had to know how pollution is created from the household level. But what else do we need to do as individuals, but also as a society? And we went there doing the cleaning, and I can tell you, again, we must involve the communities around the spaces that we want to create change so that they own those processes. Because you clean today, you go, tomorrow they still create more pollution in those spaces. These goals of advocacy, of course, we are doing this to promote green transition in the discussion we are having, from use of oil, coal, to clean, safe, and renewable and efficient energy systems, but also encouraging businesses and the governments to ensure that they, especially the private sector who are in business, to ensure that everything they are doing is creating positive impact in the environment. And Dr. Kabugi here has mentioned a lot of things. Allow me to make the final ones, then I invite Anika, and I said I will invite her with some questions. This in Kenya and around the world, advocacy. One, first is strength or exchange for co-creating alternative scaled solutions. Because without co-creation, you are doing things for someone else and you expect them to implement. No continental and global movements in climate action through amplified storytelling. And I think men have told stories. And I think this is also we need the young people to tell their stories. And these voices can be projected and be more amplified. To undertake joint advocacy and lobbying to make policy and financial flows responsible to locally shaped climate solutions. We have the FLOCA, financing of local-led climate actions. The count people have said 43 or 44 out of 47 they have enacted, but also the FLOCA is coming. How are we involving people, including the world, to have this? But use of indigenous knowledge with different communities to address climate change and increase resilience. And we all know that people have indigenous knowledge on how they have been dealing with climate change issues. If you don't involve them, your new innovations may not be. And finally, to enhance the use of climate strategies for efficiency and sustainability. How do we embrace the new innovations to increase efficiency and at the end of the day ensure that environment is well protected? And I want to finish with the quotes of Barack Obama. Mahatma Gandhi, to feel the impact of climate change has been demonstrated by the University of Nairobi presentation. And the last generation that can do something about it. And I think we have to do something about it. I themed my presentation, climate change advocacy, the good, the bad, boiling. I think now we are boiling, we are not even warming. And you can attest to this. Anika is going to tell us on how Europe has been boiling in this previous summer and how they have seen things that they have never seen. Finally, the earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not his greed, according to Mahatma Gandhi. If we do not live in a way that is more in keeping with nature, it will make us all poorer. So let us keeping with what nature can be able to provide so that we are not more poorer, even when and now allow me to invite Anika to come and answer a few questions as she does her presentation. And one of the questions I could want you to address is you share with us your experience from Sweden on matters of environment and climate change and sustainability, and how, because it's good to learn in the conference, how has Sweden handled? Sweden it's not in Kenya, it's first world, right? It's a developed world, let me use that. How have you, what is your experience with regard to the discussion you're having? The second, you working in CEDA as a donor, what more can you do, or do you need to do in order to address climate change issues in this very dynamic geopolitical environment that we have, and how the development cooperation is being tweaked to be responsive to this dynamism that we are seeing in the face of climate change. Thank you so much, and welcome, Anika, so that you can be able to respond to this.
Thank you, Jackson. Wow, Nice to be here. My name is Annika Otterstedt. I work at the Swedish Embassy. And as Jackson said, I come from the Swedish Development Agency, SIDA. And I've been working there for many years. So I've followed the internal discussions at SIDA and in Sweden on environment and climate change and of climate change, I must say, before development cooperation global-wide took into consideration enough environment and climate change. It took way too long. I think the reason was that people tend to think about development as socioeconomic development. And at least in our part of the world, it was, so you know, first you need socioeconomic development, then you take care of the environment. And in spite of the fact that all environmental economists and people with environment, including all the nature conservation, environment, climate change, non-governmental organizations said, and the research institutions said, that we need to think about everything at the same time. It took time for us to change. And I'm not saying that we did not have the political goal, because already in 1988, Swedish Development Corporation received its objective, sixth objective, which was precisely environmental sustainability, and that was in the up-run to the Rio conference in 1992. But you also have to implement. So at that time, we also financed a lot of World Bank, IMF programs, which were sometimes sustainable, sometimes too large scale, and sometimes not that sustainable. But also a lot of people in this part of the world, if I may say so, on the African continent, have not precisely been asking for sustainable solutions. People have, at least the politicians, have also been asking for socio-economic development progress, which have not taken ecosystems, biodiversity, climate, environment into consideration. So it has not, it's been a little bit of a joint venture. It reminded me very much of one of my favorite speakers and knowledgeable people in Sweden. He's been speaking about these issues for many decades. So to respond to your question, Jackson, I think that what we need to do as a small country complaining about in Southern Europe, we need to, first of all, implement our own policies in our part of the world, contributing to an EU which is more sustainable, more interested in preserving its nature, and more conscious about the have on our other countries in the world and other people. The different lobbying groups and different countries as well. As you know, the EU consists of many countries. Some of them are very progressive on environment, climate change. Some of them are not. This summer, when we had the warmest summer, I mean, it has been the warmest year ever on Earth, as we know of course, calculated. People started, you know, becoming a bit afraid, especially in the southern parts of Europe, where the degrees were above 40 for many weeks, and people die because of the heat. So, and a lot of people in Europe, as in Africa, do not have, you know, the possibility of traveling or installing air conditioners. They are poor. We have a lot of poor people in Europe, or old people who are very affected by the heat. And also in the Americas, of course, the United States, especially in the southern parts, a lot of people affected. So the discussion now is, of course, in the up-run to COP28 and also now the African Climate Summit, how can we, in this world, on this earth, but I mean the earth will prevail. It's not that, you know, everybody's going to die just because the human being is not here any longer. Sorry to say, we will eventually die out. But I mean, I think most of us would rather like to stay. We have the responsibility to ensure that not only we, but all other species on, and therefore, and that is also why we see the conflicts, because we need the private sector. You said, what can development cooperation do? the truth is not much. What we can do is to support civil society, such as from CIV, other civil society actors, research, of course, government activities. We can collaborate with neither. And in Kenya, I must say, it's a very good example of how development cooperation funding is very much talking to the private sector, to the banks, to the credit givers, to the industry, to see how can we together ensure that people both are employable, that the activities of the industry are sustainable, that we set aside also financial means to support local communities which have never contributed to climate change and who are still very poor and vulnerable because they have been left aside. So how can we support Kenya? And that's where I think Sweden has its, I mean, I'm heading the development cooperation in Kenya. What do I want to change? I want us to enable Kenya, yes, 5 minutes left or over time left, okay. How can we support Kenya in the transition of ensuring that the economic development that is taking place here, and it is rapid, I think, development, how can we ensure that local communities, vulnerable groups are included? And as you said, looking at the drought, I mean, I spent many days up in the northern parts of Kenya, and you see these children and you see these old women and men, and they have nothing. And you wonder, how is this possible? Kenya is a rich country. You have a lot of agriculture, you have a lot of industry, you have a lot of rich people. Many rich people in this country. Too much corruption also. But in spite of that, how can we as development partners include everybody, support the inclusion of everybody? And from what I've heard the president speaking, he seems to be a bottom-up development partner, no rich person or scarcity of water and food, us in Europe or in other parts of the world. You have to demand from us in order to ensure that capital is invested in. That's what we can do here. So just to mention a couple of things that Sweden is doing in terms of the African Climate Summit and the Climate Week is precisely to finance young people to be able to participate, young people from Africa. So 400 delegates are coming, and Sweden is supporting them to come here. And some of you are part of that process. And that is one way of supporting the dialogue, the communication between also African countries. Hopefully that will be transferred to COP28. Other projects and seminars that we will be part of is of course within the agriculture sector. It's with the large banks. It is with green just transition projects. And that is of course, I think, a good opportunity now during this week that so many people will come together from all over the world, but part of it is that it will enable many, many conversations between people that have good ideas that will be able to push them forward, very important role. So what I will bring back with me from what I've heard today is that we should keep, it is based upon what the people in this country is in. Stories telling people living in Sweden, how is it to live in a context, in a local village or in, you know, out on the countryside in Kenya, and to be hit by climate change or loss of biodiversity. What is it like? Does anybody want to change positions or not? So thank you for letting me speak here, and looking forward to the conversation. And if you have any questions, please come forward with them or call me at the embassy. Thank you.
So Annika, before you sit down, we'd like to give you a small token of appreciation for your time and also your insights.
Thank you.
Dr. Mombi, will you do us the honors? So we'll do it just here. Okay, it's fine. Yes, you can stand. Yes, and I hope you're going to get very many phone calls. Thank you so much. So now I know you're very tired of sitting. There's been a lot of information, but just give us a few more minutes so we can have a panel session and just talk about the things that have been discussed here, the climate justice, the climate advocacy, for just a very short time. So I'd like to invite Eastern and South Africa manager at Forum CIV, and he is an accomplished development economist with over 17 years of experience. Welcome, Jackson. Next, I'd like to bring back on stage the man who gave us a lot of thought-provoking information, Dr. Kibugi. Please come on stage. So, another round of applause for Dr. Kibugi. Dr. Robert Kibugi is a Kenyan environmental and land lawyer and an advocate of the High Court since 2006. He's a specialist in environmental and land law with experience in teaching, researching, and advising clients on climate change resilience, climate change lawmaking, land use law, and I could go on and on and on. Another round of applause for Dr. Kibugi. I'd like to invite Titus now. Titus is a program manager at Forum CIV. Thank you. And last but not least, I'd like to invite the gender balance in this panel. Judy Waroe. Judy will be moderating our session. Judy is an environmental lawyer and an ESG specialist. She's an independent legal and corporate governance consultant, trainer, facilitator, corporate secretary, and board member. I could read the long bios, but I believe we'll give them, Judy will give everyone an opportunity to introduce themselves. So Judy, take it away. But I think just before you start, we may have to move Jackson to that seat, so that we are one big family. Yes.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for welcoming us very warmly to the podium. As you've heard, my name is Judy Waroe. You know, other than climate change and those kind of issues, I think we also have other issues like sitting, becoming the new smoking. I know you've been sitting for a long time. I'll just request that we just stand and sit, so that just stand and stretch a little bit, so that at least we have your attention in this session. I know we are standing between you and lunch, so you can lean to one side, and you have to lean further than I am leaning. Of course, I'm the minimum. Okay? All right, thank you. Have your seats. So very quickly, I'll request to just introduce themselves. I think it will be very, we have already had an opportunity to speak, so maybe we can start from Titus.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Titus Kuria. As said, I work for Forum CIV. I manage a program called Public-Private Development Partnerships, but beyond that, I'm passionate about getting communities with the right information to discuss in the right spaces, because in that way, then they're able to champion their own development. So that's the reason why I'm here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I get another chance to introduce myself. My name is Robert Kibugi. As I said earlier, I teach at the Faculty of Law of the University of Nairobi. I did not intend to scare, but also hoped that we can see things for what they really are and be able to reflect on them and become better advocates for the reality and accountability.
My name has already been said, so I don't want to repeat. What I'm looking forward to this discussion is different perspectives. I don't know how many people are in here, if there are 70 or 100, so I'm looking at learning of 100 different ways of addressing environment, climate, and sustainability issues. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you for that. Our constitutional provisions and what they provide in terms of our rights to, a clean environment, and also being able to protect and conserve the environment, ensure sustainable use of resources. He also displayed this UNEP report on global climate change litigation. And I just wanted to just give a few pointers that came from that litigation, that report. It's the third of the 2023 is the third report, and some of the cases that have been reported there are mainly from the north, area of jurisprudence that is growing. And the litigation here is being defined as those cases that raise material issues of law, fact, in climate mitigation and adaptation. So they say that there are about over cases going on, cases being introduced, and we've seen a few examples that were given. Our own judiciary has, we had the Environmental and Land Court, but now we're having an Environmental and Planning Court, so a split, where we've seen the judiciary establishing a court to deal with environmental issues, really elevating the place of this kind of issues that we're talking about: climate change, pollution, loss of biodiversity, and the responsibility of government, responsibility of private sector, and so on. But the question, I think, if we are to start with Dr. Kibugi, is, from your presentation, there's a lot of, law looks very complex to many people, and I think this has come out even from the previous presentations. These interventions that we're talking about, we're saying it's expensive. So is it accessible? Is it really accessible? I can have an opportunity to also have their voice heard.
Well, thank you very much. The world has truly changed when a lawyer is being asked to comment on accessibility of law and justice. Judy knows the law school, the time we went to school, it was the other way around. Law was meant to be complex and difficult. How else will you stay in business? But that's besides the point. Indeed, laws can be complex, laws can be complicated, and people do go to school for up to 6 years to try and understand these things a lot. But the drafting and the writing of laws has also evolved a lot. If you look at the current constitution and you compare it with the one that was repealed in 2010, the readability has improved, the understanding has improved a lot because they had in mind a distinction here that it is important for every one of us in this room and elsewhere to make a point to at least interact with the Constitution of Kenya. It is available at kenyalaw.org. It's free. It's free. You can read it on your phone, you can read it on your computer. It's available, it is free. So let's begin by this. We speak a lot about public participation and action, but you cannot take on what you don't know. You understand? Knowledge, you must know it. We need to begin to interact with things like the Constitution. A lot it's available. But in terms of implementation of this, when I was making the presentation earlier, I think I made the point later and I said, look, I began with the political economy and science and the law later because I wanted to demonstrate to you that the law follows the event. It doesn't lead, isn't it? And in this case then, even for us here who may not be trained lawyers and for members of the public at home, I'd be less concerned with understanding what Section 23 of the Climate Change Act says. I'd be more concerned with the sense I get that there is an injustice. You understand? The sense I get that there is an injustice. The moment I do believe that there is an injustice and there is a sense, because injustice is a logical process, isn't it? Or illogical nonetheless, but it is the sense that I get there is an injustice arises, somebody else will help you fit into the puzzle. And this is, I believe very strongly, that this is the first place where, Judy, we put in proactivity. Let's work with amongst ourselves and with the people around us. Let's try and figure out where is this injustice we are feeling it is. You know, when you have a headache and it goes on, you get a fever, it goes on, where do you go? And how do you get there? Because you get to go to the hospital because you felt, right, that headache is not normal, isn't it? And then, you know, a doctor figures it out and eventually says, I think we need to test you for malaria, we need to test you for these, and then they find a solution, isn't it? And the reason I'm saying this is because the legal system is very complex and can be confounding. There are obviously many gifted people amongst us who, without legal training, will figure it out. But I would actually to say, complexity notwithstanding, I think the first sense is for us to try and understand and decipher where the injustice is and take it from there. It is expensive, and then I'll finish. It can be expensive, and a lot has been done in the last 2 decades to deal with this by our judicial system, etc. It used to be that if you brought an action challenging a corporation or a government, they would tell you to pay deposit something called security for costs. And it would be very substantial, up to 25% of the contested amount. So that would be an automatic way of killing things. Most of those things have gone. It used to be that if you wanted to sue the government, you had to give them 40 days notice that I'm coming for you. Again, most of those things have changed. And nowadays, in a human rights public interest litigation issue, courts don't award costs, so you will not be required to pay the cost for the other parties. So there are things that are happening along the way, but where we fall short is having a properly structured, publicly available public interest defense system that allows for members of the public to use this, because no matter how we look at it, eventually we will still require to use professional skills that may not come at cost, but we do have a very well-developed civil society in the country, I would think, that is also doing a commendable job. So it's not always about the problems. I think when something is working out, we say it. We have the likes of Kituo cha Sheria, Natural Justice. They're doing an incredibly good job taking on government and others, and access to information, and going to court, commenting on bills, challenging laws, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kibugi. And I agree with you, law follows the event. But something that you said, sense of injustice, I think that's where the work that Obare and Titus are doing comes in. So how do we make people at the grassroots have that sense that there's an injustice here? Because, you know, it's not raining. How do we know that there's some injustice going on, you know? And now we are really bringing it down to that person in the village, because Dr. has said, the lawyers here, We went to school for 6 years. So when you have a headache in terms of there's an injustice, come and see us, and then we'll figure it out from there. But how does that person at the grassroots, and maybe the work that you do, how are you empowering these people to be able to know that there's something going on and they need to take some action?
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to pick it up from where Dr. Kabugi left, because I think he has also an understanding of participatory processes. And one way of using a headache is to actually enable the lowest person of a community to understand what does it really mean. So when you talk about a headache, then they can actually connect it to the other problems. But then how do we help them diagnose an injustice? I think that's part of the work that we are doing in various ways. But when we talk about justice, whether it is climate justice or justice in all the other areas, one, we are talking about fair treatment. Communities have to actually go through a process of identifying whether this is fair. I mean, how many times in this forum have we heard about public participation? So then it's about meaningful involvement. Am I involved in this process? Am I involved in creating solutions? I think Annika talked about co-creation when she was there, but how are we ensuring that the solutions that we are creating for people are actually their own ideas, and it's not us who are in this room going back to the communities and telling them that this is what we think is the solution for you. And then also about power imbalances as well. And all day here we've heard about making choices. And the statistics that Dr. Kabugi here presented point to us that we have to make choices. Someone else mentioned that we have to change our culture. But I mean, I think in the last 2 days we had a conversation that people can only change if they know why they are changing. I mean, if we don't help them see, why am I changing from having a large herd of livestock to something better, then I will not change. So it's about giving people the right information. And as long as we come up with all the innovations and we want to save the world, but we also need to create opportunities, and justice is also about giving people the power to make choices. I mean, all of us sitting here, if today the government came up with a policy and said, we all need to have solar in our houses, I think 70% of us here will be able to do that, because, I mean, we have the ability to do that. But then how do we create just systems that enable everyone to have equal access to the opportunities? So I think to do, and I mean, the whole discussion about justice again is the principle, is the basic principle of humanity. If you are doing more damage, whether it's in your house, whether it is in your community, then it should be automatic that you need to do more to solve that problem. So it's about values as well. How do we ensure that we are instilling the right values? I like what Jackson mentioned when he talked about children, and the initial conversation we had about building bridges initiatives. It was about instilling values in our communities, in our culture, starting from our children. I think that's a real bottom up. So thank you.
Thank you. And I hear you talking about, empowering the people at the grassroots. What about capacity development? How are we, what kind of specific maybe examples can you give about how we are building this capacity? And maybe Jackson, you can tell us a little bit about this.
Thank you so much, Judy, for that, and Titus and Daktari. Capacity development is quite broad, as you can imagine, And at the grassroots, what kind of capacities do you want to give these people who are marginalized and not able to participate in decision-making spaces because of their very nature of who they are? And they are different categories. So I could want to talk about capacity development in very many ways. One, in terms of knowledge, do they have the knowledge, the know-how of the things that are happening around them, combined with their indigenous knowledge? How do they combine this to make changes or advocate for changes that are desired at the next levels? First, development in terms of financial resources, because our these people, then even what you are talking about, they are not able to understand, they are not able to connect. And in fact, one of the speakers some time back mentioned, you keep talking about the new constitution, Dr. If this new constitution is not coming in the so that it translates, you talk about we have a new, what new is it? If it's not translating into healthcare, if it's not translating into good public goods and services provided by government, if I can't have food on the table, then it is not new. The old continues. So capacity, we look at technical capacity, which a community may not have all of them, but we also have community resource persons who can own this knowledge and they are able to build the further down to the others. And I can use an example. We have what we call community mobilizers in Forum CIV. They are the community. They are the resources. Anything you want, knowledge, they take it there. In law, you have the paralegals who are able to, they are lawyers, but they are able to unpack all this information in a more usable way. Communities. So when you talk about people who are passionate and they can be able also to unpack it further to these communities, these are the real things, and the community is able to share. But also, capacity in terms of governance structures. In the morning we talked about climate governance, but they also understand this. Without the community understanding who and which office is responsible for a particular action, then you have not actually built the capacity of that community. You just stand in between as a go-between for them. They need to know who and where to access particular service. So that empowerment in itself makes sustainable change in the pursuit of the environment injustice they are pursuing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackson. I think you've really brought out the issue of capacity development very, very well. But coming back to Dr. Kibugi, what about at an institutional level? We are talking about justice and looking at the grassroots, at the individuals. But what about those small businesses? How does the legal fraternity then come in to address maybe the issues that they may be facing as small businesses, institutions, or organizations, but at that grassroots level?
Interesting twist to small businesses. I see she's a student of the bottom-up transformation agenda. I'm just kidding. But I would like actually to a more unconventional switch, borrowing something that he spoke about earlier when he made the distinction between advocacy and lobbying. And I think that small businesses, with lobbying defined as the space you take, the space you demand, what small businesses in this country require is actually lobbying. They require to demand for space. And the reason is because we've spoken about the ability to diagnose the injustice you face. The owners and operators of small businesses understand how climate is impacting them. They understand if they get their raw materials from farmers. I'll give you an example. A common discussion at the moment in climate adaptation in the agriculture sector is the post-harvest losses, the fact that it ranges from 8.5% up to sometimes 20%, depending on how perishable goods are. So if you produce viazi, tomatoes, vegetables, the likelihood of going bad, a lead time of 4 or 5 days, if you don't get a market, it goes expensive. So farmers in rural Kenya are trying to work with who are small business owners by themselves, are also trying to work with even smaller startups that are providing refrigeration services You lease a solar provided refrigeration facility, you can stock your stuff there, and if you get a market work, sometimes the owners can help you get a market, isn't it? So you can already diagnose the problem there, isn't it? The solutions there may be, I remember one of the panelists made the distinction between zero rating and VAT exemption, for example, isn't it? So it is them that can, there is the ability to diagnose that problem and then engage with the policy makers to determine how to make these facilities available or to save them from those losses. Because, for example, when you suffer aflatoxin infestation in maize and other cereals because of moisture levels, it's irreversible. You can't even sell it for animal feed. It is simply garbage. Now, what you have, isn't it? So those kinds of things. So there is a need for a dedicated effort at diagnosing from the climate lens what are these problems, we call them injustices here for ease of communication, that are facing small businesses. But else also take a bit of an unconventional approach to what is a small business. Because the farmer that has got a cow that provides 10 liters of milk they need to sell is a small business operator, isn't it? They may just not be incorporated. They are a sole proprietorship. But when there's a glut of maize after the rainy season and there's an oversupply of Napier grass and grass, they can't sell that 10 liters, so it goes bad. That is a post-harvest loss, isn't it? So how will they fund their... So my point with all those examples is there is need for that level of lobbying. And going with the same concept, there is a need to work around with small businesses to try and diagnose what are these climate-sensitive problems that are affecting viability of businesses and profitability, and try to address them from that perspective. Because if they don't, then the other approach is dealing with a problem after it has arisen. At that point, a small business owner is facing a commercial bank that is demanding repayment of a loan that they don't have any means to pay. And you recall earlier on, I gave the example of households that are selling critical assets in order to survive. So it's one path we can avoid by trying to take a different path altogether. Of Ugali directly is that unlike the previous dispensation, we have freedom to speak, to be here, to question government, to lobby. You won't be thrown into prison because you went to try and lobby the county government of Nakuru or the Treasury CS. No, you won't, isn't it? I mean, sometimes they overreact, but it is contained. So we do have the democratic space provided for by the Constitution that can be used for this purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Lynette is... I don't know whether I'm sensing injustice here. But I'm told our time is up. Yeah, when we were just getting into it. So maybe if you give us 2 minutes for the panel to give us their parting shots on this issue of climate justice and activism at the grassroots level. We know at the higher levels we have a lot of activity and involvement of the legal community. When you talk about emerging areas like the ESG, reporting, the PPP bottom line, all these things are happening. But we wanted to focus on grassroots. What is happening to that person right there in the village who goes to take, to borrow some money from the bank, and they are being asked for